Greetings everyone, this is an introduction to Croy chapter 30 with a look at the verb stημι, which means to stand. We begin with the principal parts and we'll see what the nub of the complication is with this verb. The principal parts are stημι, steso, estesa, that's the first aorist, or estein. This verb has two different aorists, a first aorist estesa and a second aorist estein. And they're not merely variant forms. They have different meanings. We'll say more in a moment. To continue the principal parts, though, the fourth principal part, hesteka, hestamai, estathain. The core issue here is that this verb has transitive meanings, like to stand something up, to set something, to establish. And it has intransitive meanings. That is simply to stand up. An intransitive verb doesn't have a direct object. So if I say, I stand up, there is no object in that case. And this is why it has two different aorists. If we wanted to use the transitive aorist, we could give a sentence like this. Estesa ton arton. I set or placed the bread on the table. Notice that the first aorist has an object, ton arton. By contrast, if we wanted to use the second aorist, which has an intransitive sense, we might have a sentence like estein te ecclesia. I stood in the assembly, or I stood up in church. We'll begin by focusing just on the transitive. This is the less common, and it's the more regular, because estesa is just a regular first aorist, and so you should find forming it pretty familiar. It has a sigma and an alpha, and it forms all of its parts the way you would expect a first aorist with a sigma and an alpha to do so. Let's just give a couple examples. Ha Jesus estesen paidion and meso auton. Which aorist is that? Well, it has the sigma. It's the simple first aorist. It's third person singular, agrees with Jesus. Jesus stood the child in the middle of them, or in their midst. That is, Jesus stood the child up, or put him out in the middle of the circle. Let's give another example. Ha diablos estesen auton epitopterugion to hieru. Here again we have the third person singular. The devil stood him, that is Jesus, upon the pinnacle, let's say, of the temple. So this is the transitive form. It takes an object, stood him, placed him. Because this is a regular form, its participles are regular. And we'll just give one example with the aorist participle. To make a participle, what do? You get rid of the temporal augment, you get rid of the ending. Our aorist stem is stase. So here is a chart of the aorist participles, and they're all regular. It may take some review if you don't remember your aorist participles. You notice that that stem, stase, occurs in the masculine, in the feminine, and in the neuter. All right, let's give a sentence and practice that. John chapter 8, verse 3. They brought the woman caught in adultery, and the sentence continues, and stesantes autain and meso. Which participle is that? Well, it has the full stem. This is stesantes. It's plural and masculine, agreeing with the they. And they, when they had placed her in the middle, when they stood her in the middle, and the sentence goes on. We won't do more with this first aorist because, as I said, it's pretty regular, and you just need to remember that it's transitive, and when you're trying to spot it and distinguish it from the second aorist, you need to remember that the first aorist will always have the full sigma. All right, time now to look at the second half of this chart. the intransitives. And we'll begin by focusing on the second aorist with its intransitive sense. I stood up. Here's how you conjugate the second aorist. Estain, estes, este. You notice there's no sigmas in there except for the pesky third person plural, which is identical to the first aorist and can cause some confusion. Context will be the guide. Let's give some examples. Here's a sentence. While they were walking, Jesus este and meso auton. Which verb does that look like? Well, there it is. It's the third person singular. Jesus stood in the middle of them. Notice that unlike the other examples we were using with the first aorist, there's no object here. He didn't place a child in their midst, just Jesus stood in their midst. Let's go and do another example. A man who had been lame and got healed, este kai periapate. There is our third singular again. The man who had been lame stood up and began to walk, imperfect of peripateo. Just as there is a first aorist participle, there's a second aorist participle. So let's take this sentence. Kai stas ha Jesus ephonasen autus kai apen, and the sentence goes on. Here we need the chart of the second aorist participle, and our stas we find here on the chart is masculine singular, and nominative, which agrees with the nominative masculine singular ha Jesus. So, and Jesus, having stood up, he ephonasen, he called them and said, and so on and so forth. So he stood up. So to review what we've focused on so far, histemi is a verb that has two different aorists that have different meanings. It has a first aorist, which is conjugated regularly and is transitive, and a second aorist, which is intransitive. Now we need to look at a bit more of the intransitive principal parts. First of all, we've encountered this problem before. If a verb is intransitive, what would its passive forms mean? The answer is they mean the exact same thing as the formal actives. If you think about if estain means to stand up, what's the passive of standing up? Well, there isn't one. So estain and estathen mean exactly the same thing. The important thing to note here is that this is not a genuine passive, it's deponent. So it doesn't mean I was stood. Moving along, there's one more irregularity of this verb, and that has to do with the perfect. The perfect hesteka is formed for the most part regularly. It's intransitive, but although it is perfect in form, it has a present sense. So hesteka doesn't mean I have stood up, it means I am standing. And you can see that's almost the same thing. If I have stood up, then I am now standing. But it'll almost always just mean standing. Something else to note. This verb in the New Testament, this tense, occurs mainly in the participle, and it has both a first participle and a second participle. I promise this is the end of the weirdness for the verb histemi. So we're talking about the fourth principal part, hesteka. It has a present sense. We're going to give some examples so that won't seem mysterious in a second. Both the first perfect participle and the second perfect participle have the exact same meaning. They just mean standing. But they do have different forms. So the first perfect participle is what we would expect a perfect participle to look like. I suspect not everyone remembers what perfect participles look like, so you might want to review. And our textbook gives the basic forms in chapter 30 of hestekos. There's also this abbreviated second perfect participle. There's no kappa, and we're used to kappa being the sign of the perfect. It means exactly the same thing, and you won't have too much trouble recognizing them, Let's give a couple examples and show how similar they are in usage. Ha de telones macrothen hestos. Telones is a tax gatherer. Macrothen, you can see macros, far. The tax gatherer stands far away. Hestos, he is standing. This is our second perfect participle. It's masculine, it's singular, it agrees with telones, it's nominative. Let's give another example. Ha aklos, ha hestekos, peron tes thalases. The crowd, the standing one. The crowd which was standing, which is standing across the sea. Here we have the first perfect participle. Again, it's nominative, it's masculine, it's singular, in every way agreeing with aklos. So to put this all together, the verb stημι has three principal parts which are transitive. It has four principal parts which are intransitive, and the perfect has two different forms of its participle, a first perfect and a second perfect participle, which happen to have the present, not the perfect meaning. I hope that's all perfectly clear. We've got sentences to practice with this, and you've got a video now you can review. So please give some attention to this important verb, because both stημι and compounds with stημι are quite common in Koine Greek.